This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Kelly Vandever, and my special guest today is Yvette Pegues. Yvette is a professional speaker, educator, author, advocate, Mrs. Wheelchair International, and the founder and chief transformation officer of Your Invisible Disability Group. Yvette works as a corporate disability and diversity consultant, and she is the host of disAbilityLifeTV. She is the author of the workbook, The Art of Adaptability, which is designed to help newly disabled and diagnosed individuals like herself. And she is the co-author of My Mommy Had Brain Surgery and I'm Okay. She co-authored that with her two young sons, Isaiah and Elijah. Welcome, Yvette, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you. Okay, so as you know, we ask a couple of quirky questions to get us started. So my first quirky question for you is, what actor would you want to play you in a movie?
Gabrielle Union. I think she'd do well. And I've been told maybe Robin Givens might be a good one, but that would be probably the one I'd choose.
Okay, so Gabrielle Union, what would I know her from?
There's a show on TV called Mary Jane, but prior to that, she did a lot of other shows in support positions. So I just kind of like her look and her acting style.
Well,
of course, Whitney Houston. Now, I don't know if you meant alive and passed on, but Whitney Houston would actually be my first choice. You know who she is, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, she'd be my first choice. I didn't know if you meant, living or left us.
I could see how either her or Robin, because I know those two. But you're so beautiful, obviously, Miss Disability, Mrs. International. So you're gorgeous, so you could play yourself on TV.
Oh, thank you.
All righty. And then the second quirky question is, tell us something surprising about yourself that most people don't know.
I speak 5 languages.
Holy cow.
And it was something I was very embarrassed about as a child, but I'm very excited to be able to speak those languages. And in addition to those 5 languages, my children also speak, read, and write Mandarin Chinese.
Wow. So have you always just had an aptitude for foreign languages? How did that happen that you learned 5 and so young as a child?
Well, I'm from a multi-ethnic family, so they call me Jamaican. So we have Jamaican, Dominican, Haitian. I lived in South Florida, where it's a melting pot anyway. So a lot of it had to do with survival, and neither of my parents spoke English, read, or wrote. So I had to adapt to the world that I lived in at home and then the world that I was, my environment, like at school and elsewhere. So French was my first language.
That is amazing. That is amazing. Well, and I'm sure our viewers are going to hear and see more about what's amazing about you too. So I just love your story. Well, you have an amazing story. Let me put it that way. So let's go there next. So tell us what your story is. What happened in your life that got you to a place where you cared about persons with disabilities having a voice to speak up?
So the answer to that question is multi-layered, mostly because I am now living as a person with a disability, unbeknownst to me, prior to my diagnosis of actually having a disability. So my voice was very important for several reasons. 8 months after my initial disability, I had no voice. I was medically mute. So having a voice has a literal and a very academic reason.
So would you mind sharing your story with folks? I've heard the whole story, but I think it would help people kind of appreciate what you're doing even more.
Absolutely. So As I mentioned in one of the earlier quirky questions, both my parents were foreign, did not have the opportunity to attend school, as most of us here in the United States do. So because they didn't read or write, I didn't even know myself. School was really important to me. So I graduated at 16. And because making money was more important than actually going to school, I got a job relatively early. I was in the workplace. My father had amazing work ethic. I paid my way through school and became an engineer. So I'm first generation high school and first generation college. And immediately after graduating with my degree in engineering, networking and system engineering, I was recruited by IBM. All this to say that I was living an actually normal and amazing life until I wasn't. Literally overnight, I found out that I was actually born with a congenitive malformation of the brain, which is called Arnold-Chiari malformation. It's 1 in a million. It's passed on from a mother to her child. So I didn't know that I had it until I had it. And shortly thereafter, I needed brain surgery to correct the issue of my brain actually falling into my spinal cord. And in the process of that surgery, I suffered a spinal cord injury. So I walked in, never walked out, and I now live as persons with a disability, both traumatic brain, spinal cord injury, and I'm a full-time wheelchair user.
Okay, so, but tell the rest of the story. Because that, I think, is even as shocking as your story is, to be living a normal life and then discover you have this debilitating disease that you were born with, you didn't even realize you had it,
Right.
and then to be disabled. But you mentioned that you had this education, but tell folks the stuff that you make. I'm going to make you brag about yourself. You're not
That's
just
so
a
hard.
normal engineer, so brag about yourself. Tell them the rest of that story.
If you insist.
I do.
So I was working at IBM as an engineer. I was on several patent teams, wrote white papers, read books. I went back to school to become an educator after my first child, Isaiah, was born, because being so left-brained and so logical, I felt like I needed more of an education in the area of being a mommy. So all the questions led to my being certified in Montessori pedagogy, and then I continued and went ahead and got another degree in early childhood education. And just after my graduation, I had an opportunity, an invitation to complete an application for a program at Harvard University, which was a EDLD program. And the beauty of that program was that they took the School of Education, the School of Business, and the School of Law and collectively created Policymakers, which is the program that was paid for by Bill Gates. And it wasn't until 6 weeks before that program was launching that I found out I had a traumatic brain injury and that surgery would change my life. So my education was cut short. I would have been the first PhD in this entire generation, but I really do feel like where I am today was just as important and just as exciting.
Very cool, very cool. So you shared with me that you have an invisible disability different than just what we can see in the wheelchair. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's the reason why I started our organization by the name of Your Invisible Disability Group, because in addition to having a physical, very visible disability where I need a wheelchair and other mobility devices to function in society, I have also been diagnosed with a developmental disability because I was born with this condition, as well as an intellectual disability. So what that meant to me at that time is that I'll probably never be called by Harvard again. My IQ dropped tremendously, and I was able to shift a lot of my education and knowledge to my emotional intelligence. So I lost my intelligence quotient, but I was able to, through the process of retraining, build my emotional quotient and get those numbers up. And that's where I function today.
Well, and I think folks listening to this after we're done will realize that your IQ must have been in the stratosphere because you won't notice any difference in intelligence because you are bright and articulate and just the things that you're doing are amazing. So I can't even imagine how high your IQ must have been to actually drop and still be smarter than me. I don't know how that works.
Aw, I doubt that, but thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to talk from the perspective of a leader, because this podcast is geared towards leaders. So, what do you think leaders misunderstand when it comes to hiring employees with disabilities?
Well, that's a really great question because there's so many types of leadership. I describe my leadership more as situational leadership because it's not something that I chose to lead in, but because my leadership chose me situationally, I now have experiences not just in the academic and work areas, but I also have what I call a life degree that was pretty much dropped in my lap, for lack of a better word. So when employers are looking at the challenges that people with disabilities have and how the challenges that they have in their workplace can be resolved, I think diversity of thought is just as important as diversity of the workplace. And I think that's important because in my case, I can say that I speak from an intersection of being a woman of color, and also someone with a disability. And my children would therefore have an experience with disability that's different, but yet relevant. And when we're creating solutions on a global scale, there's always someone on either side of the terminal with a little less understanding a possible true and diagnosed disability that requires adaptation. So if a company would feel comfortable bringing in someone with a disability, it would give them the perspective of project teams, clients, and end users who may be interacting with their solution with a disability that individual may recognize and be able to help in the solution process.
So how does the leader bring up the conversation of how do we help bring somebody with a disability onto our team, or how do we integrate somebody that maybe develops a disability into continue to be a contributing member to the team?
It's a really good point because I was actively employed prior to my disability. And the reason why that's special to me is because I changed. My skill sets became almost the opposite of what they were prior to my disability. So obviously, it's important to understand that person's strengths, or in my case, abilities, as instead of the disabilities. And I don't think that it should be a target as much as we're going to hire people with disabilities, but understand that we want to hire a broad range of individuals with different experiences to build our team to look like our client or customer base or the global solution that we're looking for. So I would say as an employer to just open up the workforce to possible disability and diversity publicly, because I know it's not said, and I know there's this disclaimer that we have to place on a lot of our documents, the EEOC statement about we do not discriminate against XYZ, but to specifically say that we're looking for a diverse workforce that will include these things. And I think it sends a totally different message than the basic and common disclaimer that's on the bottom of every application.
So how does that, how when you're consulting, for an example, with organizations on this topic, how do you advise them to open up that way? What are there things that they can actually do to be proactive in including disability, persons with disabilities as part of their diversity?
Absolutely. So assuming that the company is large enough to have a diversity unit or a diversity business unit or program in place, that's a good place to start, only because there are relationships that are being built within the diversity and inclusion organization within the company. So it really does start with relationships. Put yourself in a position where your audience may or do have disabilities, to take that step forward and to make sure that your corporate responsibility is clear in your recruitment efforts. So I would say in my part of the country, there are companies like Disability Link, there are companies like Vocational Rehab, and all of these organizations that help train people who are either entering the workforce for the first time. Goodwill is a great advocate of training people with disabilities and retraining those who have changed somewhere in their work experience or are getting back into the workforce, but to basically partner with those organizations that already have access to the groups that you're looking for. In addition, when you're posting positions, you can even say, especially when you're looking for someone for a specific solution, you can talk about your audience. Disability is not just economics that we miss, but it's a people group. And that people group is 4 out of every 6 individuals. So it's a large people group, most of which you won't find disclosing for pretty obvious reasons. And it's also an $8 trillion industry. So it's a win-win-win.
Okay, so can you talk more about that? We've touched on invisible disability, and you talked about yours,
right?
And then you said this statistic: 4 out of 6 people have a disability. So connect those dots for us.
Absolutely.
Because I don't know that most people would guess that 4 out of 6 people have a disability. So tell us more about that, so that
Absolutely.
we're aware.
Absolutely. So statistics show that approximately 75 to 80% of people with disabilities have invisible disabilities. And you may not think about it until I start saying things like depression or cancer or suicide. Those fall within the invisible disability category. Those are more commonly seen as standalone conditions, but they do fall into this large people group. In fact, the very largest people group in the country. And so when you think of some of those chronic pain issues and some of the issues that you may not see when you meet someone, or may be triggered by an environment or a situation, that accounts for a large number of the people with disabilities. Wheelchairs and mobility devices and those disabilities that are apparent probably only count for about 15% of people with disabilities. And these numbers do not account for those who may have mental illness or are incarcerated. So it now, in my conversation, brings about some other things that people may not think about. And when you look at the statistics, 4 to 6 people, we're talking either you yourself, a direct member of your family, which may be a mother, father, or child, will have a disability between the numbers of 4 to 6.
Okay, so when it comes to employment, I remember we had a conversation earlier, and you mentioned that a lot of people don't disclose their invisible disability. Would you mind talking about that some more?
Absolutely. So because there's such a large number of people with disabilities, and there's this shame built into the community itself, there's discrimination expectations. So a lot of people who may currently be employed, who either may or may not have had an invisible or visible disability when they went in, would not feel comfortable disclosing, which means telling their employer, communicating or updating their employer that they now have an invisible disability, because of fear of job loss, because of fear of discrimination, and because some of the laws that are in place may not be executed or at least practiced at the workplace. For example, there is federal funds that are given to companies that may hire our military personnel or someone with a disability or within a specific ethnic group. And if the company is not actively searching, practicing, or talking about that, then you may not find someone within the company willing to disclose. And that's a really sticky issue, because I've been asked that question: do you or do you not disclose when either applying or moving about in a job that you've had for several years or what have you? So that's a very sticky area. Employers have asked me questions as much as those seeking employment and those who are already employed.
So how do you answer that question about whether people should disclose the invisible?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm really glad you asked, because it depends. And the reason why I say that is because you can very clearly determine whether or not the job responsibility that you're taking on specifically impedes a disability that you are experiencing. For example, if there are physical limitations, for example, in my case, I'm in a wheelchair. I probably can't lift more than 40 pounds. If my job requires that I lift 50 to 80 pounds, I may disclose then that I have a disability that prevents me from lifting weights that are required for my job. And so in my case, if I were asked by someone either applying for a job or experiencing a new disability while on a job, my answer would always be, Does it impact your work? And if you need help figuring that out, speak to your physician, speak to your either your physical or occupational therapist to help you make that decision. The reason why I say that is because if you go into a work condition and you have this fear-based behavior, then you want to feel comfortable enough that you've said all that you needed to say. And so obviously honesty is the best policy, but if it has nothing to do with your job, if there are elevators and not stairs, there's no reason why I should have to say that I'm in a wheelchair, even though it's obvious. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I like that explanation. I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, that, because it's physical and it seems obvious, but you'd be surprised. There's a lot of employers that may not have an environment where a wheelchair would be conducive, like, around machinery or, maybe a building that has been formally introduced into the historical books and cannot have any adaptations to the physical space to allow for me to use an elevator or some other type of lift device.
So what are some of the things that might, so most of us are used to seeing handicap stalls and ramps, but in our conversation earlier, you really enlightened me that there's things that we don't realize within that whole realm. So would you, what can you provide folks with some enlightenment on what some of the real challenges are for people with disabilities in the workplace?
Of course. So I want to preface that by saying none of this was obvious to me until I myself became disabled, and these barriers became visible to me. So I wouldn't really hold it against anyone independently, but I do hold employers responsible for training and teaching the culture to understand the architectural and attitudinal barriers, one of which is pretty obvious. I think you kind of touched on it. Bathroom stalls. Bathroom stalls usually are a standard size. So let's say out of 20 stalls in a large bathroom, you may have one or two that are accessible. And what that means is maybe the largest stall in the room, it may have maybe a changing table in it. But in my case, it's the only one I could use. So if the other 19 were available, I'd really have to stand by until the person in the larger stall had completed whatever their needs were in that case. So I would just say to participate in the advancement of access and inclusion, to make a decision. If there are other stalls available, then choose to use the ones that you fit in, because that would be the only one in this example that I could fit in. Parking spaces seem unnecessarily large, but in my case, the ones that are marked van accessible in a handicapped parking space require that I have a van in most cases, and or have like a ramp or my wheelchair or some other reason why that additional space is necessary. A quick example is that my van has a 6-foot ramp, and I have all the markings on my van that says it's an accessible vehicle and that I need at least 8 feet. But I have people parking really close to me, and I have people parking in the diagonal lined area. And so that means that I'm stuck in that parking space until that person comes out.
So so there's so many things that we just we take for granted, or we don't understand.
Yeah, I think we take it for granted, and we don't understand what's on the other side of that particular rule or law or signage. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not something I would have paid attention to, but it's something that I've had to see firsthand as someone with a disability. So I think another thing that I need to share in this particular context is that it's about an inclusive tomorrow, not about making special circumstances and availability for those with disabilities, but to recognize that if we live long enough, there's a very good chance that we may experience, or someone in our immediate family may experience, either a temporary or a long-term disability. And I say that because there's not just accident, illness, and injury, but there's also aging that falls into that category. So if at some point you are creating an inclusive future, it's as if you're creating it for yourself and those you love. Based on these statistics, it could happen sooner than you think.
All right, thank you. That's important for us to remember. I agree. Yeah. Okay. So What so is there a right way for leaders to address the issue of accommodation with somebody with disabilities?
Yes. And the relationship I spoke of earlier is very helpful because you may not be able to have that conversation thoroughly with the individual with a disability. And I don't think you should for the most part. I think the culture needs to be cultivated. And what that means to me is that the people in your workforce, the physical building where you work, and the understanding of the law, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, is necessary prior to bringing someone in with a disability. And I find that to be important because it makes the conversation with the individual easier. So if your culture is cultivated prior to bringing in diversity and disability, then the conversation's easier. Everyone is familiar with the expectations, and it really just becomes a tweaking because there are no two disabilities, they're identical. And what I mean by that is there's thousands of other people in wheelchairs for very different reasons than myself. So they have different needs, they have different triggers, they have different accommodations that are required. But if ergonomics is already in place, if the workforce is already educated in that area, the conversation becomes easier with the individual. There are individuals who have either service animals or they may have a personal care assistant with them, in which case the conversation still needs to be had with the person that has the disability, your employee, your coworker, not their caregiver.
Well, and that brings up a point. And I shared with you that I did something rather stupid once, and I'll share it with the audience so
Okay.
it will make more sense. So I was in a Toastmasters contest, and I was a person in charge of running the speech contest. And one of the contestants was blind. And he was escorted into the room by a sighted person. And they joined me where I was shuffling papers and getting people to sign forms and whatnot. And the person that escorted him asked me if I was Kelly, and I spoke to her, and then I had a question, but I didn't ask the man that was blind. I asked the person that was escorting him, and he's like, I can hear, I can talk for myself, and I felt really poorly that I felt stupid. I felt like he wasn't trying to make me feel stupid, but I'm like, of course, he can hear and he can talk. So it was just an illustration to me that I felt like I had been insensitive. It wasn't my intent, but I was stupid. So what can we do to avoid being to avoid being insensitive, or how do we recover when we do mess up?
Well, that's a great question. And I know that you weren't intentionally being insensitive, but behaviorally, if we are 99% of the time used to dealing with someone who's sighted and dealing with someone who doesn't have an assistant next to them, then the confusion layer of what to do next never becomes, an issue. But in cases where you're dealing with someone with a disability, quite honestly, just ask. It sounds oversimplified, but you would be amazed at how effective asking the question may be. Because again, if you didn't know that person had been vision impaired, you could have been pointing, to something, and they may not have seen it, which is probably where their assistant or caregiver might jump in. But it's okay to say, please tell me what your accommodations are. Tell me what you need. What's the best way to communicate with you? How can I make this event, this occasion, this office, this workspace effective for you to operate in and to be your very best? It's really no different than you would ask anyone else. If I brought in an intern or if I brought someone new into my organization, I would have similar conversations, but I would need to also understand enough to bring the right people into the conversation or direct them to the right people, because sometimes that might be facilities management. But in your case, it's a very, very common error, but it's one that you can recover from just like you would anything else, right? You just apologize. And instead of assuming what's to happen next, ask, well, I apologize for that. I guess that's pretty obvious. How should I refer my questions? How should I direct them? What is the best way to make this as comfortable as possible for you?
Good, good. I wish I'd had that advice many years ago. All right. So speaking of I like how you phrased that, just like you would ask anybody else that was coming into the workplace, what can we do to make you comfortable, to get you up to speed, or whatever.
Right.
You use the example of an intern. There's a question that you shared with me. You were talking about an organization that was bringing on people with disabilities, and there was a question they were afraid to ask. Can you share what that question is and why they were afraid? And let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So one of my clients, big business, were bringing in disability and diversity candidates. And one of the questions they had in a closed room session where you can ask anything without any judgment, the one question that came up then, and it comes up pretty often, is how do we fire them? I would hate to fire someone and have them believe that it's because of their disability, but it's really maybe something totally different. And that question comes up more often than not. And even when it doesn't come up, I address it because it's an internal fear. And I can understand where a company may feel there's some risk involved. And my answer to them is, if your process, if your protocol cannot apply to someone with a disability, then your protocol needs to change, not just for this one individual with a disability, but for everyone. And the reason, again, why this is important is because fear-based management never leads to anything positive. So if you come in knowing what your responsibilities are, and you have an open door policy, and you have a work period where this person has time to process the information and the work that's required, there's no reason why disability should come into play. Now, it may come into play, but as long as that conversation is had early, and that your human resources and policymakers understand that this one rule should apply across the board more often than not, then you already have what you need to start bringing in someone with a disability or diversity differences. And that's where I come in as a consultant. I can help you look through your current HR policies and processes to confirm that that's in place. And that's why the consultation is so important before you start bringing in people with diverse backgrounds and experiences and disabilities in this case, and dispositions, because you want to make sure that those things are cleared to the best of your ability so that it's an easier transition for everyone.
Very good, very good. And I really appreciate that you brought that question up when we had talked before, because I do think that that is something that, you, like you said, behind closed doors, or even if they don't say it out loud, they're thinking it. So I love that you addressed that right up front. And I could see how that'd be very valuable to the folks that you work with. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So if we have a person that's listening that has a disability, what advice would you have for them about speaking up in the workplace?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. I would recommend, depending on the level of disability and depending on how long they've been in a workforce, to have someone on their behalf to support them. Some of the organizations that I mentioned earlier will always have an advocate outside of the workplace to help you prepare your conversation, if you will. So if there are some grievances, some of them are just human grievances. They have nothing to do with your disability. So the fear is usually on both sides of the employer-employee conversation. So to have an advocate, and again, while building these relationships, it comes with an advocate who you can now call and say, hey, you know what, Yvette, I'm having this issue at work. Is this a disability issue or is this just an Yvette issue? Because I really love my job. The expectations are higher than I expected, or whatever the circumstances are. It's really great to filter that through an advocate that understands both the laws and your specific job duties. And so that person can be a third party without any type of buy-in, if you will, to give you the best advice. And it's always great to have someone to have that conversation with before you sit in with your manager. And early on, again, based on the relationship, many relationships that I either mitigate or mediate, I am sometimes that person. So I have the trust of the employer, human resources, or that manager, in addition to the trust and responsibility to the employee that's coming in with a diverse background or disposition, so that conversation always looks at the best interests of both parties.
So we're definitely going to include all your contact information in the show notes. Are there other organizations that people can reach out to find these advocates?
Absolutely. Now, again, it depends on where you're listening to this from. There's always a vocational rehab in every state. There's always a Goodwill or an advocate program in place. Now, we have GCDD here in Georgia, which is a General Council for Developmental Disabilities. There are so many different work opportunities that you can get through these organizations, and they automatically come with mediation. Disability Link is another option, but depending on where you live, there's always an advocate in your area. Again, I'm happy to help you find your advocate in another state, but for the most part, there are federal, state, and local resources for people with disabilities to go back to work, because federally speaking, we are so much more effective pouring into the to the deficit, if you will, or as you put it, making money rather than receiving social services. So there's a lot of support out there to get people with disabilities back into the workforce or to stay in the workforce, because the more of us that are making deposits into our economy, the more lucrative we are to make change and to afford change, not just in the area of disability, but some of the other really important areas based on your geography.
Okay, cool. Now, so that applies to folks in the United States. We do have listeners from all over the globe.
That's great.
Do you have any? Do you know much about things outside of the U.S.? Or do a lot of countries have these kinds of services as well?
Well, it really depends on the country. I have had the pleasure of spending some time in the UK. I know that London is very advanced, but there's something called the Disability Treaty that each country is engaging in, and they're using the United States as a platform for how they deal with disability architecturally and attitudinally in their own country. So we are the model for disability for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So you will find like services either in play, or you look from the government down. So even in Canada and other parts of the country, there's always a disability difference, or in some countries, they still use the word handicap services that are out there. So that might be a good search criteria for you as you start to look for people in your country.
Okay, great. All right. Well, you did tell me one story that I was hoping that you wouldn't mind repeating for me here about losing more than just your luggage, and I think it's a good illustration of some of the bigger issues. Would you mind sharing that story?
Not at all. When I worked for IBM, I traveled about 90%, and I thought I had a problem with just some nuances of traveling then. But now traveling as someone with a disability, it's completely different. In my case specifically, because I am codependent on a device, in my case, it's a wheelchair and some other type of manual devices that I use to travel, I have found that the airlines are hopefully doing a little better based on the FAA complaints that have been submitted, in that our bodies are attached to these machines. So in my case, if my wheelchair breaks, it's as if my legs have been truly amputated in that moment, and I have very few options. And what I'm finding as I work on different advisory boards for international and local airports is that a lot of the recovery money is put into replacement and not as much into training. When you talk about travel, I'm not just talking for airlines, but I'm talking train, buses, and even taxi services. So it's very important to understand that this equipment is part of our body, and we need it to be able to travel, not just to other cities and countries, but just from point A to point B. So much like the conversation that we have with individuals, it's very important to have the conversation with the individual who is using the device as to the best way to treat that device so that they receive it in the same way that it was given to you during their travel. Another thing that I found that some people don't know is that every single airline or travel industry has a specific person in place. I know that in the airline industry, they're called CROs, C-R-Os, and they're representatives that are specifically put in place to help people with disabilities travel without incident. So they will help you go through the myriad of checkpoints that may be different than someone who's not traveling with a disability. For example, going through TSA, making sure they have the proper number of assistants to help you on and off the airplane or onto that particular transportation device. So that's a good place to start when you're traveling. But also keep in mind that when you're traveling, do as much as you can in advance, get there as early as possible, have as many questions written down or answered ahead of time, and if possible, have someone with you. That is also very, very helpful depending on the level of your disability. Even in my case where I can communicate verbally, it's always easier to have someone with me because it makes my travel so much more pleasant, if you will. But it is important for our travel industry to understand that people with disabilities, especially those of us who travel with equipment, understand that number one, we shouldn't be charged extra for carrying our equipment or checking our equipment in. Number two, if it ends up somewhere different than we are planning for our destination, that causes a really big problem, and your having an alternate method may not be good enough. Because like I said, every disability is different. So if you have a room full of wheelchairs, just in case mine breaks, that might not always meet my immediate need. And then thirdly, recognize that people traveling with disabilities are coming into that space in most cases with a lot of fear and anxiety. So the response that you might get in the industry is never personal. It shouldn't be anyway, but keep in mind, especially someone traveling with a disability, you may find that interacting with that person could be a little challenging. So having someone on your team who is either familiar with dealing with those of us who are traveling with disabilities, present or at least available. And industry, speaking for industry, the benefit of having someone with a disability travel through your method means that I may come with an animal, and I may also come with 1 to 5 extra people. So we provide exponential industry for each one of those travel organizations, and we're not just traveling alone. So it should be seen as a benefit and not a burden.
Right. I when you told me that story about, I can't remember, did they damage or did they lose your wheelchair?
They lost it.
They lost it. That's what I thought.
They could not find it. It went somewhere completely different. And I was in the aisle chair, which is a high back, really, really slender chair that allows me to fit through the aisles of an airplane, and it wasn't very stable at all. So I didn't have many options. Fortunately, I was visiting my sponsor, who happens to be a wheelchair company. So Pride Mobility went and just brought me in another identical machine because they didn't find my wheelchair for, I think, 2 days. So I would have been without it for 2 days on a 3-day trip. So it's really good to have a backup and, make sure that if for whatever reason that your particular device is missing, that a replacement is there. And they do have aisle chairs that remain on the plane in flight. So imagine, if you will, for toileting purposes, you're going to need to have that equipment on your flight, especially for those that are going out of the country and exceed the 3 to 5 hour airtime.
Yeah. And it's just not good enough to say, oh, well, we've got another wheelchair you can use. That was eye-opening for me. That was
Yeah. It's almost like saying, hey, I'm sorry we lost your medication, but we've got a Band-Aid.
Yeah, exactly. Good example. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions before we sign off. So my next to the last question is, what questions have I not asked you that you wished I'd asked you, either pertaining to leaders that are managing people with disabilities or people with disabilities themselves?
Well, there's a few things, and I want to be fair to employers and business owners in that, what does it look like to make your building or your business accessible? And in the experiences that I've had up to this point, it's been pretty negative. I have heard things like, well, it cost me more to get you in my building. And that's true. And that's true. But the good news is that people with disabilities, especially those with very strong skill sets, because we do, we offer so much to employers just because of our loyalty base. Once we find a great employer, just like anything else, we're there to stay. And I think that's an important component that needs to be taken into consideration, and also to consider inclusion in your solution. Your solution is not just so Yvette in a wheelchair could get in your building, but those power doors are also used by other people who may not have disabilities just because of the convenience of it. And I know that even with just air quality and some of those things, it's almost better sometimes to have a power door. And heating and cooling and all the other great things. So when you look at a solution that may be presented to you as a disability solution or a handicap solution, look at the bigger picture, and I can obviously help and maybe even provide some basic information about what the bigger picture looks like. And that, I think, will help in the decision making and the acceptance of those decisions when you look at the total big picture outcome. And I have so many people, and one case in particular is OCD, which is an invisible disability. And that may not work in a lot of particular jobs, but we placed a young man who was on the autism spectrum, and he had strong OCD tendencies, but he was perfect in the operating room because his specificity and how those tools were set to that table, the direction, the cleanliness, and everything that would have otherwise been seen as bad or inconvenient worked perfectly in the operating room because his abilities were specific enough to the job requirements that it happened naturally. It was organic. It was an organic match, which is why when we match people with disabilities who are looking for work, we look for their abilities and align them with the job requirements. So those things are pretty amazing when you see them actually come together. And then the thing I want to say on the other side of that, if you are listening and you have a disability or you know someone who does, recognize that there are people in the workforce who may or may not have a disability that support your efforts. And I know there's some fear in leaving the home because in your home, more than likely, you have everything you need exactly where you need it. And the fear of leaving that environment can be so overwhelming that you just choose not to. But in order to affect change, you need to be in the way. Being in the way is not always a bad thing because until you're in the way, we don't realize that something's wrong, that something's in your way. So get into the world, involve yourself in activities. If you haven't gone back to work and you fear some of the challenges you'll have, volunteer. Go in without the stress of getting fired or feeling like you'll be reprimanded, but you will be welcome there. So I always say in a lot of the things that I share with people with disabilities and employers is go where you're celebrated, not tolerated. And a volunteer situation is always a wonderful opportunity to be celebrated just for showing up and providing your gifts, your talents, and your abilities.
Excellent, excellent. So well said. Okay, so my final question for you, on this journey that you've been on as an advocate, a surprise advocate for people with disability, what have been one or two pleasant surprises for you along the way?
Well, I've never been in a community that works so hard. I guess I can summarize that by saying, the mother of invention is necessity. And so as people with disabilities necessitate things to accommodate them, they become pretty good at creating solutions. And so many things that are created today have come from the area of necessity in the world of disability. So an amazing surprise for me as an engineer, having worked in IT and loving it so much, is all the assistive technology that me and my children get to play with. It's so incredible, the things that are in place that not only people with disabilities can use, but others who may have learning or attention or even script limitations can use. So having been now introduced to the world of technology as it relates to disability has been a bonus for me, because not only am I meeting great people, but I'm getting an opportunity to interact with great technology that can, will, and already has changed the world.
Very cool. Very cool. Yvette, thank you so much for being our guest today and for sharing what it is that you do and for your work as an advocate. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.